All right, looks like people are logging in. Lovely to see you all.
Yay!
Nice to be able to see people's faces. Thank you for keeping your cameras on. It's good to be surrounded by human beings rather than just black screens.
Poner eso.
Just let me set up the YouTube side of this so that it is out and being recorded. Let me go ahead and do that. All right, we'll just give it a minute for people to finish logging in, whether it be through YouTube or through Zoom, and then we will get underway. If anybody has a burning question while we wait, I'm happy to try and answer it. If not, then we'll just enjoy each other's company, which is something that humans do a lot. All right.
Hi, everyone.
I think we've had everybody log in that's coming in at least on time, and I don't want to keep you folks waiting since you made the effort to be here on time, and I like to reward that. So now that the YouTube is up and steady, and we've got everyone else who I normally might expect to be on, let's get down to work. We have another holiday, and yes, I do know that today is Yom HaShoah. Hopefully you also know that if you watched last week's video and participated in that class. Today is the Holocaust Remembrance Day. If you want more information about that, plus the other two upcoming modern holidays of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Memorial and Independence Day, please check out that video as well. But we are going old school for today's class because we are in the midst of a preparation cycle towards the next major festival, what is called a Chag, a festival, one of the Shalosh Regalim, the three pilgrimage festivals mentioned in the Torah itself. And that next major holiday is Shavuot. But unlike other holidays, Shavuot has a long buildup. Shavuot has a long lead-in. Shavuot is linked by a chain to the holiday of Pesach, which just finished. And so we are going to talk about that chain, that link, that lead up, as well as the holiday itself. And I'm going to wonder why it didn't click. There we go. So that lead up, that chain, is what we call the counting of the Omer. The counting of the Omer is the special way that we count between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot. And we learn about this counting from the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. And you will count from the morrow after the day of rest, meaning Pesach, as we'll see, from the day that you brought the Omer of the offering, 7 complete weeks, and the day after the 7th week will number 50 days. 7 times 7 is 49, plus 1 is 50. And you will offer a new grain offering to the Lord. All right, in this short little section, we are actually getting a lot of information about the ancient world and our modern life as well. So the holiday of Pesach, the day of Pesach, is most famous, of course, for the Seder and the eating of matzah, the bitter herbs, and all of the other things that we do. But if you were a farmer living in the ancient land of Israel, or indeed if you were a farmer living in the modern land of Israel and cared about the cycles of nature, you would also know that on Passover was the beginning of a special offering of grain, specifically barley. Barley grain was the earliest ripening grain in the ancient world, which meant it was the first crop to be harvested in large quantity that would put an end to the winter famine, if you will, the winter lack of new food. People had food stored, but obviously it was a relief when the barley came in, and we were now in that process. From the time of that barley harvest, we would then count the 7 complete weeks, 49 days, And on the 50th day, there would be a new grain harvest. That would be the beginning of the wheat harvest, which was even more important than the barley harvest. So both Pesach and Shavuot are not only historical holidays, and we'll go into Shavuot's history in just a second, but they are also agricultural holidays, teaching us to follow that flow of nature, that cycle of life, to be grateful for the produce that sustains, barley, as well as the produce that lets us grow and thrive, the wheat. As anybody will tell you, wheat generally tastes better than barley in most types of recipes. And more specifically, for the ancient world, wheat was a much more calorie-intensive food that allowed us to live much better than just eating barley. More bang for the buck for the acre that you plowed. And that was very important back in the day when people worried about getting enough calories rather than worrying that they had too many. Now, there is a question of timing, and this is something that will often come up when people are criticizing Judaism of not being Torah true. That it says that we will do this after the day of rest. Now, the day of rest, many people take to mean only Shabbat. However, our tradition reads this word in context and says, no, that's not the only way to understand the day of rest. Sometimes it is referring to the holidays as well. For example, in Leviticus 23, the very chapter from which this passage is taken, telling us about the counting, both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are also called days of Shabbat. Now, this cannot mean that they must be on Shabbat, because you might have thought, well, that just means that's when you should schedule them, because they are 10 days apart. And it is physically impossible to make 2 days both be on Shabbat and be 10 days apart. It's just not the way time works. If you count the rotations of the planet, you can't make 7 equal 10. So we count from the end of that first day of Pesach. The first counting of the Omer begins on the second night. So it's often included as part of the second night Seder, and that sets us up for the holiday of Shavuot. Everyone with me so far on the math? It's not too complicated yet. Oh, come on. There we go. Every now and then the mouse goes to sleep. So the counting of the Omer is a mitzvah. As you see, it was a commandment. And that means that each night we say a blessing before we do the count. And we make sure that we count not only the days, but also the weeks. As you may have noticed from the verse, it says that we will count from that day and that we will count 7 weeks. Well, in order to make sure that we are counting correctly, not only 49 days and or 7 weeks, we do both. And so we will say this is the 8th day, which is 1 week and 1 day, in order to cover both variations of how you might count this period of time. Now, since it is a mitzvah, that seems to be implying that each day is required and seems to be implying the total is required. There is a compromise when it comes to if you make a mistake. If you fell asleep without counting the Omer that night and you woke up the next day, then you are in a quandary. Do I continue to count, or since I've missed my day, do I now give up? If you miss the day, you can keep counting, because there is that opinion that is the total count that is most important. But because we are not 100% sure whether you are fulfilling it in the proper full version, we do not include the blessing. The blessing at the beginning is a meditative focus, and it is thus not absolutely required for the fulfillment of the commandment. However, it is best to make sure that we are in the proper focus, what we call kavanah, intentionality when doing it. So we do ask to do the blessing if we can. But since it is not 100% required, if we've made a mistake, we don't include it, because we would never include a blessing with God's name if we weren't 100% sure that it was needed. Oh, and this time period of the counting of the Omer is an unusual one, because after the giving of the Torah, a 1,000+ years later, this time period between Passover and Shavuot began to become difficult. It's explained as follows in the Talmud. They said Rabbi Akiva and his 12,000 pairs of disciples, living from Gabat to Antipatris, all of them died in a single season. Why? Because they did not treat one another with respect. It was taught that all of them died between Passover and Shavuot. So there is this hint that there was a mass death that happened during this time period, and as such, the counting of the Omer takes on a somewhat mourning period, almost as though we were still grieving for those that died. Now, the Talmud gives a explanation that the death happened because of the mistreatment between them. However, this may be a more coded language or an attempt to give a more neutral lesson rather than perhaps the original cause. We see from Rav Shriya Gaon, who was a great rabbi a few hundred years after the Talmud was written, that Rabbi Akiva raised many students, yes, during his time period, but there was a religious persecution, what's referred to as a shmada of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, what would that religious persecution be? Why would there be something aimed specifically at Rabbi Akiva and his students? Well, if we go to the Talmud again, this time the Jerusalem Talmud, we can see that in the words of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that he taught Rabbi Akiva, my master, would expound the verse, a star will come from Jacob, as Koziba, that is to say, Kochba, meaning star will come from Jacob. Now, who was Koziba? Well, Koziba, also known as Bar Kochba, was a revolutionary Jewish leader who tried to lead a revolt against Rome that was wildly successful until it wasn't. And when it failed, there was mass persecution and a mass slaughter of the people that supported them. And who happened to support him? Well, as we just saw, Rabbi Akiva was reading the verse about Jacob as being a foretelling of Bar Kochba, of Bar Koziba, and that means that he saw him as being a potential candidate as Mashiach, as Messiah, which meant that Rabbi Akiva and many of his followers allied themselves with Bar Kochba during that revolution. As such, when it failed, there was mass persecution. When Rabbi Akiva would see Bar Koziba, he would say, there is the King Messiah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said, Akiva, grass will grow from your cheeks, and still the son of David will not have come, which is a way of telling Rabbi Akiva that this is not the Messiah, and unfortunately, you and I are going to be dead and buried for a long time before the Messiah actually appears. This is not it. It turns out that Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta was correct, and unfortunately, there was a mass slaughter of those who had risen up against Rome at that time, 134 BC, 134 CE. This was the last great revolution against Rome, and from this point onward, we did not resort to military might to try and challenge Rome, but instead focused on preserving our wisdom, our faith, our communities, and ensuring that that would outlast the Roman Empire, which was successful. As this is a time of mourning, it is unfortunate that it has been reinforced over time. The days after Passover became a rather difficult time for Jews throughout the Christian world. And so the Omer's semi-mourning really reflected the mood of those communities as well. Why did the time after Passover become so problematic for us? Well, the blood libel, which is a lie that was concocted, well, quite anciently, but really took on new life in the Middle Ages of Europe. It told that the Jews would take a Christian, usually a Christian child, they believed, and that we would use their blood to make matzah. And this was supposed to be our way of substituting for the blood of Jesus, who, of course, was crucified at the time of Easter, which is usually concurrent with the time of Passover. So the Christians invented this lie against us, and that meant that the heightened anger and passion of people during the Easter period would often be directed as open hostility to Jews, and many communities were attacked, many people were murdered and injured, and a great deal of violence was done during this time period. So after Passover, the communities would be on pins and needles worrying that somebody would begin a new call for an attack against Jews, that maybe a child had gone missing and that we would be blamed, and that this could bring down another reign of terror upon us. So this reinforced the mourning atmosphere of this time period. So what is the mourning atmosphere? Well, it is customary not to cut our hair or shave our beards, the same way that a person will not do during the first 30 days of mourning, and to avoid unnecessary celebrations or purely social entertainments, such as going to live music concerts. Now, at the moment, during COVID, we're not exactly going out to concerts anyway, but this has continued as a mourning process. So this has made it difficult for some of our celebrations. Indeed, as I talked about last week in the celebrations of Israel's Independence Day, there are some traditionalists who object to the celebration in ER being so full-throated, full of joy, because it still falls during this time period. However, most authorities, myself included, believe that the celebration of the new state of Israel is certainly a good reason to overrule this custom that had been put in place, as this is a custom and not a mitzvah derived directly from the Torah. Questions or comments? All right. So this brings us to one of the holidays that is tucked away in the counting of the Omer, what is called Lag BaOmer. Lag, I'm going to have to break it to you, has no special meaning. It is instead the Hebrew letters Lamed Gimel, which in the way the Hebrew alphabet can be used as numbers means 33. Lamed means 30, Gimel means 3, Lag is 33. It's not the Hebrew word for 33, but it is the acronym for the word or for the number 33. Hebrew letters, much like Roman numerals, can be used for numbers. So the 33rd day of the Omer has a special nature. It has a special feeling to it. Again, this is not found in the Torah, but it is connected to the traditions of the Talmud. And it is said that this was the day when the plague, the massacre, the retaliation against Rabbi Akiva's students stopped. So that 33rd day became a day of celebrating because the tragedies had finally finished. The 33rd day of the Omer is also considered to be the yahrzeit, which is the anniversary of the death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is credited with writing the Kabbalistic text, the Zohar. So this makes it a very special day of celebration, and the mourning restrictions are lifted. You will see many people getting haircuts on this day. It is often a common time for people to give the first haircut to a baby or child. Huge bonfires are huge bonfires are lit. It's important to read what's meant to be there, not what my fingers typed. And as I mentioned, some perform ushparim, that's the cutting of the hair for the first time, and thousands visit the traditional site of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's grave, in the north of Israel, near the city of Tzfat and Tiberias. So if you ever have the chance to be in Israel for Lag BaOmer, it is a lot of fun to see the bonfires dotting all over the cities and streets. It's not so much fun to have the ash going everywhere, and we can be thankful that as polluting as many of our energy sources are, it is still better than just having wood fires being burnt by everyone. There we go. Which then brings us now to Shavuot, the holiday itself, the main course, if you will. This year in 2021, Shavuot is going to begin in the evening of May 16th. And as we'll talk about, there is a special celebration to look forward to for the evening that goes above and beyond the usual service. So Shavuot is mentioned a few times and in a few different ways in the Torah. In Exodus 23, when giving a list of the holidays, it is called Chag HaKatzir. and the feast of the harvest, of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the field. So Chag HaKatzir, this feast of the harvest, is considered one of the nicknames for Shavuot. It is also called Chag HaBikurim, which comes from Numbers 28, also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new meal offering to the Lord in your Feast of Weeks, the other name as we'll see, you shall have a holy gathering, you shall do no work. This is a reminder that Shavuot, much like, the same as Pesach and Sukkot, is a day very similar to Shabbat in the restrictions on our work. That's a class that I have not yet given, so you can look through the back archives if you are waiting. But if you're willing to be patient, that will be up very soon in the curriculum. The only exception is for our festivals, that we are allowed to do cooking on those festivals for the festival, as long as it isn't also overlapping with Shabbat. And of course, the most famous name for Shavuot is Chag Shavuot, taken from Deuteronomy 16. Then you shall observe the Feast of Weeks for the Lord your God, offering your free will contribution according as the Lord your God has blessed you. Meaning that you bring according to whatever it is that you have been blessed. If you have a lot, you bring a lot. If you have a little, you bring a little. It depends on how much you are able to do. So that's the general origin and gist of it. And as you can see, there is a heavy emphasis in the Torah on Shavuot as being a harvest holiday. It is the Feast of the Harvest, the Feast of the First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, which, as we saw, is the weeks that we're counting from the harvest of Passover to the harvest of Shavuot, the barley harvest to the wheat harvest. That is not the only thing that we celebrate on Shavuot. And if you are beginning to feel like maybe you're left out of this farming holiday, please understand there is a historical event as well that gets celebrated. But first, we need to deal with the produce. So the Bikurim, the first fruits, what is that all about? Well, the Bikurim, these first fruits, were brought to the temple from Shavuot onwards. This was the beginning moment that a person could bring these first fruits. Now, these first fruits were the first harvests that were taken from the produce for which the land of Israel is praised. There are 7 species that are special to the land of Israel that Deuteronomy 8 tells us. Wheat and barley, we've already talked about them, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. So there would be a special offering that a person would make when they would bring these first fruits, and they could start bringing them from Shavuot, or if they came later, that was fine too. And when they did, they came with a special declaration. As it says in the Mishnah, quoted at the bottom, at the rise of the morning, an official says, "Rise and let us go up to Zion, to the house of the Lord of our God." And an ox walked before them, its horns covered with gold and with an olive crown on its head, decorating the ox. And a halil, a flute, was played before them till they reached the vicinity of Jerusalem. So they are going as a parade, each village, each town, sending the people who are going with this ceremony. Upon coming close to Jerusalem, they sent word ahead and decorated their Bikurim. With baskets still on his shoulder, the Israelite read. So they come with this basket now, all decorated, flowers and other forms of decoration. And the person bringing the basket would say, this is the farmer himself, "I have told the Lord your God this day that I have come to the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give to us. My father was a wandering Aramean, and God brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the land that you have given me, O God." That sounds familiar, and as you can see, there is a lot missing from the middle. It's Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 to 10, and this also forms one of the central points of the retelling of the Exodus, of us being down in Egypt and then us being brought out. And this is part of the retelling that we do in our Haggadah. So another way that Passover and Shavuot are linked is through the sharing of this text. So they would make this declaration as a way of saying thank you to God, not just for the harvest, but to see their harvest as part of the scope of history. You've probably all noticed by now that Judaism very much wants us to contextualize our individual life whether it be our joys or our sorrows, within the tapestry of time, to have our personal feelings, but to recognize that they are part of a larger narrative, of a grander story that involves each of us as main characters, but also involves each of us as supporting characters for one another. Support from the past, just as we are support for the future. Now, it goes on to say, after completing the entire portion, he places the basket by the side of the altar, he bows down and goes out. And then the rest of the ceremony continues. And you can read about that in more detail if you'd like in the Mishnah or in the Mishnah Torah. But I want to bring you to this idea of psychologically how these holidays are working. As we can see at Pesach, that barley harvest ends that winter famine. The counting of the Omer is when the spring harvest is continuing. It is bringing hope and rising anticipation of the future harvest. That wheat harvest then brings in joy. Now we are feeling more confident. We have made it through the different rain cycles of Israel. The plants have blossomed and bloomed. We have seen the wheat grow strong. We are bringing it in. We are feeling assured that through our long days of hard work, we will eventually end up with our barns being full, our silo and storage being full. We will be prepared for the next winter. And of course, that fullness is celebrated during the holiday of Sukkot. More on that later in the year. But all of this is also understood, as I'm going to bring you back to the timeline in just a second, but I want you to see the art as well, as being a historical timeline, because Shavuot is considered to be the day of the giving of the Torah. As I said, I'll flip back to explain the math on that, but understand how these all fit together then. With Passover, we celebrate the ending of the slavery. With the counting of the Omer, we are not just counting the grain, we are now counting the days between our slavery and the giving of the Torah. Once the Torah has been given, we then begin the long march to the land of Israel, parallel to the days of summer and the work that is involved. And we are then provided shelter, both during our trips through the wilderness, as well as eventually in the land of Israel as well. We get that sense of completeness with the holiday of Sukkot. Now, you probably noticed that in my discussion of Shavuot earlier on, none of the texts from the Torah called Shavuot as Zman Matan Torah, as the time of the giving of the Torah. However, it's not because the Torah didn't realize this, it's because the Torah thought that we already realized it by doing the math. Now, if you're like me, most of us have read these various verses and not been fully cognizant of the timeline. Most of us, especially when we're just reading it casually on Shabbat morning as the Torah reading is going on, are not sitting down with a pen and paper, God forbid, we don't write on Shabbat, and doing the math of tracking our trek through the wilderness. But if you do, something becomes very clear. From Exodus 19, it says, on the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered the wilderness of Sinai. This is giving us a timeline. The 3 moons would be Nisan, Iyar, and Sivan. So we enter the wilderness of Sinai, we get to Mount Sinai itself, where the Torah will be given, on the beginning of Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the first day of the month of Sivan. Then, on the next day, Moses is given a command that says that you shall be a kingdom of priests. We are given this preliminary explanation of what is about to happen. On the next day, Moses is told to set up a boundary around Mount Sinai so nobody will go up it, and that there is now a beginning of a period of abstinence, that people, men and women, have to abstain from relations for 3 days, which means that when we reach the 6th day of Sivan, we are now celebrating the giving of the Torah. And all of this is mapped out in much more detail in the Talmud and Shabbat 86b, but you can see that from the counting that we end up with the 6th of Sivan as being the day of the giving of the Torah. And that happens to be Shavuot. The Torah has so much confidence in our mental arithmetic that it didn't even feel the need to tell us this explicitly, but that we should have been counting from the time of leaving Egypt to the time of the giving of the Torah automatically, because it told us to count that time. And if we had been doing it, then we would be startled to find ourselves indeed celebrating the holiday of Shavuot. And wouldn't you know it, when we carry out this in this way, when we have the counting begin the day after the first day of Pesach, and we count our 49 days, lo and behold, the 50th day is Shavuot. The math works, it all fits. Any questions? Sorry, I should have asked before moving on to the next segment. I know it's sometimes hard to ask questions. I should remind you that if you'd like to ask questions through the chat function rather than by unmuting yourself, that's perfectly fine. It's just feel free to ask as you wish. And if you're very, very shy, you can always ask me a question by email. Now, on the holiday of Shavuot, we have a special practice of reading from the book of Ruth. Now, each of the 5 Megillot, the 5 special books that come from the latter part of the Tanakh, what are called the Ketuvim, the writings, correspond to a different holiday, to a different time. Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, corresponds to the holiday of Pesach. Shavuot has the book of Ruth, and Sukkot has Ecclesiastes. The other two, since we only have 3 pilgrimage festivals, the other two, the book of Esther, Megillat Esther goes with the holiday of Purim, because it is, after all, her book and her holiday, and the book of Echa of Lamentations goes with the celebration, commemoration is a better word, of Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning. We will be covering those other holidays. Well, Purim we already did, but the other holidays in more detail later. Excuse me. But why Ruth for Shavuot? Shir HaShirim, the love song between us and God as our newlywed period, makes sense with Pesach, because that's when we began. The book of Purim, as I mentioned, is obvious. Lamentations is obvious with the grief of the destruction of the temples and more. And of course, Kohelet as its great reality check and humbling that all of our hard work may please us, but it is not actually the point of life, comes as a wonderful counterbalance at the holiday of Sukkot, our thanksgiving for the agricultural bounty. But Ruth seems a little less clear until you start reading it with the mind of nature, with looking at the natural flow of the seasons. For it turns out in Ruth 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me please go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So what is the time of the gleaning? What is the time of the harvest? What is the time when people would be out, when they would be sleeping, when they would be sleeping in the fields to do their harvest? That is from the time of the wheat harvest. So the whole story of Ruth takes place during Shavuot and the Shavuot season onward. So it is very fitting. However, there is a second reason. As I mentioned, Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah. Now, the giving of the Torah also should connect to the acceptance of the Torah. God didn't just give the Torah, we had to reciprocate, we had to agree, we had to bind ourselves together with God through the Torah, what we call the Brit, the covenant. As such, the words of Ruth, who also had to accept the covenant by converting from her native religion to become Jewish, is a very appropriate figure to echo the feelings of all of our ancestors who stood at Mount Sinai and willingly chose that life. Indeed, Ruth's words from chapter 1 are stirring to us all. But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do, if anything, but death parts me from you." Ruth's categorical decision to align herself not only with Naomi, but with the Jewish people and with God is a beautiful testament to her passion and her devotion. And as we see from the rest of the story, she becomes an exemplary person, really somebody that we can all look up to and emulate. Now, the concept of accepting the Torah is a difficult one. Most of us in the modern world accept that the Torah was accepted and that happened in the past and it was done. For most of us, it's like the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was a historical event. Some very famous people were there. There's a wonderful portrait of it. You can go to Philadelphia and see the place. Go to Mount Sinai if you like as well. Not that I would recommend it quite at the moment. But, it's a thing that happened. It's not a thing that impacts me in my own life, in my own feelings, in my own spirituality. But on Shavuot in particular, we should try and understand it differently than that. And in fact, the Talmud begins a discussion that tries to show us the importance of this choice that we have made to accept the Torah and how that has, through the gift of the Torah, set us on a different path, set us on a unique course. So if you will listen to the story as I explain. When the end of days arrive, meaning we get to the end of the earth, when redemption is at its moment, and God is judging the world to see how it did. Notice this is not meant to be scary and terrifying, although if you have been a terrible nation, then you might be a little bit alarmed when suddenly it turns out that what the Jews have been saying all along was right. And that is where we pick up our story. The nations of the world stand before God to be judged, and they will say to him, meaning this is their defense, Lord of the world, in point of fact, did you actually give the Torah to us? And we refused to accept it. So they're saying, hey, you can't hold it against me that I didn't follow the Torah because you never actually offered it to us and we didn't refuse it at that time. Now, I'll point out that our tradition says that, well, actually they did. And here's how that's understood. How can they present such an argument? Since it is written, the Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir to them. He shined from Mount Paran in Deuteronomy 32. And also in Habakkuk, God comes from Teman. Now, what in the world did he want in Seir, which is another country of the ancient Middle East? And what was he looking for in Paran? Said Rabbi Yochanan, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, made the rounds of each and every nation and language, and none accepted it. None accepted the Torah until he came to Israel, and they accepted it. So the interpretation is that God did offer the Torah to all of the nations, and they did not willingly accept what was written within it. They did not willingly accept that idea. However, the nations may have a defense to this. They may say, okay, but did we accept the Torah and then fail to fulfill it? Meaning, all right, maybe you offered it to us, but we rejected that. You can't hold us to a contract that we refused to accept. If we didn't fulfill it, well, that's no harm because we didn't agree to fulfill it. It's just like someone cannot show up at my door and say that he has painted my house and I owe him money if I never made a contract with him. Indeed, he might have painted my house, but that doesn't mean I'm beholden to him because there was no contract. But to this, the answer must be, why didn't you accept it at all? The rebuttal here is, do you think that you can remain guilt-free simply by never admitting that there are things that are wrong in the world? Do you think that as long as you choose to think that everything is okay, no matter how bad you behave, no matter who you murder, rob, or betray, that you're fine and off the hook as long as you never signed on the line saying that you wouldn't murder, rob, or betray other people? That is not the way it works. God has asked the world to accept justice. And indeed, Judaism doesn't expect the rest of the world to accept the Torah itself, but we do expect the rest of the world to accept that there should be a measure of justice in every nation, that there should be a commitment to that justice and fairness in every community. And the details may look different from land to land and culture to culture, but justice should still be a part of it. And in the ancient world, we know that justice was in short supply. So instead, there was an alternative explanation. This is what they will say before God in their defense: Lord of the world, did you hold a mountain over us like a vault as you did to Israel? And then did we refuse to accept it? What are they talking about? Well, it is written, and they stood at the base, but the word base translated is literally the word beneath, tachat, that we stood underneath the mountain. Rav Dimi Bar Chama said, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, held the mountain over Israel like a vault and said to them, if you accept the Torah, well and good. If not, then this will be your grave. So the nations will argue that the Israelites only accepted the Torah because God threatened them and that God didn't coerce the nations, so therefore they should not be held liable. Now, as you might be guessing, this story is much more about the Jewish relationship to the Torah than an actual historical description of how the other nations of the world will relate to God. Instead, this is trying to teach us that sometimes it may feel that we are forced to accept the Torah. Sometimes it may feel like we were captured and driven from Egypt to Mount Sinai, and then somehow or other coerced into accepting the Torah, almost as though the mountain was held over our heads. After all, God had taken us into the middle of nowhere. God was providing our water, God was providing our food, God was providing our guidance. And then he said, and here's a contract. If we said no, would God have just left us in the desert? Were we kind of obligated? If you're on an airplane and the pilot says, thank you all for joining us on this flight. Now that we are halfway over the ocean, I'd like to tell you that we're going to come around and collect any valuables you have. And if you choose not to give us the valuables, well, you can get out here. Is that a real choice? Even if they give you a parachute, is this an option? And so too, some people might feel that the acceptance of the Torah was under duress. And that would be a problem because anything done under duress does not count as a true acceptance. But instead, what this is trying to hint at here is to say, if we think more deeply, what does it mean to be the people of Israel, Bnei Yisrael? What does it mean that this was our choice between life and a grave? Does that mean God would have extinguished us? Does it mean we all would have died in the wilderness? No, we would have been able to make it out. There were plenty of options of ways that we could have left that wilderness much earlier if we were not interested in following what God wanted. Instead, we recognize that if we had done that, if we had walked away from the Torah at this point, meaning walking away from God's guidance and God's instructions for living a life, then we as Jewish people, we would be dead. As individuals, we might be alive, but as a nation, as a group with this wisdom, as a people who are carrying forth this idea in order to give instruction and light to the world, that would have stopped, never really begun. It would have been as if you had a group of friends who sat together and said, hey, you know, we really should go into business together. We've got a great idea and a great product. We should do it. And then they just walked away from the table and never did it. Their project was dead on arrival. It never took off because they never were willing to come together, sign the contract, and make their commitment. So our commitment was not under duress, but it did have consequences. Choosing to ignore what God had offered to us would have meant the extinction of our nation as a nation, but not us as individuals. Choosing to accept it, of course, means that our nation, which had just been born at past Pesach, would continue, and in fact has continued for 3,000 years, which I say means we've definitely gotten our money's worth from this agreement. Questions or comments on that point? All right, then let's talk about how we celebrate Shavuot. Some of the things that we do in commemoration of this day of the giving of the Torah. So, one custom is the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Now, the Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a night of study. Why? Why on this day? Well, there was a midrash, there was a teaching that the Israelites went to bed early the day before the giving of the Torah, right? You know, there's a big day tomorrow. God's going to give you the Torah. You want to get a good night's sleep. Makes sense. Unfortunately, sometimes going to bed too early can mean you get up too late. You can oversleep. And God had to rouse them to wake up and come accept the Torah. Embarrassing, to say the least. So Rabbi Joseph Caro, who lived in 1533 or around 1533 CE, began a practice of studying all night to prevent a repeat. That way we would be wide awake, more or less, give or take exhaustion, to show our devotion to the Torah at the morning service for Shavuot. This would fix the literal meaning of the word tikkun, our earlier error. And indeed, we still have this custom. Now, not everybody will stay up all the way through the night, and indeed, it is not required. It's a nice experience to have sometimes in your life, but it is not a commandment. It is not a required custom. As you can see, it is only 500 years old, which is still pretty recent in Jewish time. But it is customary to have at least some bonus studying on Shavuot evening. Last year and this year, we have been doing online Shavuot studies. We have been doing a virtual tikkun along with a service for Shavuot. And I would like you to join us for that. It is through the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando. So we will be sending out information regarding the program and its link and sign up and all of that. But do keep your eyes open for that date in May when we have this option. Hopefully next year, we'll be able to do this process all together in person like we did in years past, where we also would join together with other members of the broader Orlando community. But for this year, it was felt to just be a little safe on the night of Shavuot and make sure that we are erring on the side of caution, but still being together. The other most famous custom of Shavuot is to eat dairy. Now, for some of you, this may not be such an issue. Maybe you're vegetarian or maybe you love your dairy. But all of the other holidays, Pesach and Sukkot in particular, and also Rosh Hashanah for most people, are days when people look forward to a nice meat meal. Maybe it's brisket, maybe it's a roast, maybe it is chicken. But meat plays a big part in a lot of our celebrations. There are voices in tradition that say that meat is a big part of rejoicing. And therefore, when you have some meat, you should save it for these holidays. I'll remind you again, we are much more fortunate than our ancestors. They were lucky to get meat a few times each year. We, on the other hand, can have as much meat as we can afford and stuff ourselves with. That doesn't mean you should. Please consult your diet, your doctor for advice on your personal diet. However, when it comes to Shavuot, there is a custom of eating dairy, which, as you can now understand, is very unusual. Now, because this custom is of relatively recent invention, anywhere from 1,000 to 500 years old, depending upon how it's been applied, the custom is a custom, but the origin is also not clear. Unlike the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, we can't point to a singular rabbi who invented this. Instead, we scratch our head and say, well, here are some explanations. Now, to my mind, the most meaningful of these explanations is that since God had told us in the days after leaving Egypt that we could only eat meat properly prepared, but had not yet given us the full details, and those would only arrive with the full Torah at Sinai, the Israelites must have been only eating dairy between leaving Egypt and arriving at Mount Sinai. So that would mean that we can commemorate their meat fast by having dairy as well. We can take away our meat, which most of us would be looking forward to, and have dairy just as our ancestors must have done, as a sign of our willingness to obey God. Even if God told us not to eat meat, we would still be able to rejoice with dairy. So that is a great reassurance to vegetarians out there. Vegans are still going to have to try a little bit harder to find their own source for joy, and that is something that I wish them much success with. Another explanation for the dairy on Shavuot is that since honey and milk are so powerfully tied to Israel, which is constantly called the land of milk and honey, and since honey and milk are also tied within the Song of Songs, which is said that there is honey and milk under the tongue of our beloved, then we recognize that under the tongue would refer to God's words. What are God's words, if not the Torah? So the sweetness of the milk, because you can't make a meal out of honey, would be reflecting our expression of the sweetness of the Torah. Questions or comments? before we jump to a new topic, because I've got a little bit of time left and I want to make sure I give you your full hour's worth. All right, so I mentioned earlier that during the period of the Omer, we don't shave, and during the period of Omer, we don't cut our hair. Now, if you are a woman, that just means haircuts. If you are a man, that means also not trimming our beard. But why are beards such a big deal in Judaism in the first place? Well, let me tell you. Leviticus 19:27. You shall not round off the corners, literally the word peyot, of your head, or destroy the corners of your beard. Seems a little strange. What is the corner of your head? Unless you are a blockhead, my head doesn't have a corner. So that means this is a culturally relative term that is going to need some additional explanation. However, it's reinforced in Leviticus 21. They shall not make a baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corners of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. And additionally, in Deuteronomy 14, you and your children of the Lord are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourself, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. It was common in the ancient world for people to scar themselves, their literal bodies, shave off their bodies, shave off their hair, or cut their skin as a sign of mourning. Although Judaism does say that we tear clothing, we do not tear our literal skin, and it is in fact prohibited. And by the way, this is also the origin of the Jewish prohibition on getting a tattoo. If we are not allowed to cut our skin for the purposes of showing our grief for a loved one, then certainly we cannot cut our skin for the purpose of mere decoration. But that still needs to let us, we still need information about how to avoid doing this. Well, here we go. This is taken from the Mishnah and then the Talmud. If a man makes a baldness on his head, meaning cuts down to the head, or rounds the corner of his head, or mars the corner of his beard, and he is only liable if he takes it off with a razor. So the cutting has to be done with a razor. That means with an actual blade that is scraping across the skin and removing the hair in the process. Still haven't told you the location, but at least now we know that it needs to be done with a razor to be prohibited, which means if there is an alternative way of removing the hair, it is allowed. So you will see Jewish men who are clean shaven. You will see Jewish men that have shortness of the corners of their head, as we'll talk about. The difference is they are not shaving with a razor. They are not cutting with a razor for their head. Instead, what they are using are electric razors or some other form of cream, or even electrolysis if you wish to go that route, to remove the hair. That is all perfectly fine, as are regular run-of-the-mill scissors. So it is perfectly possible to be a clean-shaven Jewish man. However, it was more difficult in the ancient world to reach that level of smooth skinnedness until modern techniques were invented. Possible, but uncommon. Nowadays, it is very easy, and therefore it has become much more common. And so, yes, if you choose to use an electric razor or other means that are not a naked razor, the straight razor kind of thing, or a safety razor, then you can absolutely be clean shaven and you are not violating this mitzvah. As the Talmud also goes on to say, anyone who is subject to the prohibition of destroying the corners of the beard is covered by the prohibition of rounding, but women who obviously are not subject to the prohibition of marring the corners of the beard, because women don't have beards, are also not subject to the prohibition of rounding. And this does go off the average. So if a woman did have a condition which caused her to grow a beard, she would still not be subject to this limitation because the limitation is based off the average of the gender rather than the individual. So women are able to shave the corner of their head if they wished. Women are able to shave their face if they wish. And if there was such a need, it's just very unlikely. So that means, according to the letter of the law, if one shaves with scissors, even in a way that's similar to a razor, meaning you end up with a similar result, this is permissible. However, it is customary among pious individuals not to do so due to suspicion by onlookers. This is indeed the proper way to behave. Now, this has become less of an issue in the modern world because there are so many good alternatives to a razor, and so there is not automatic suspicion that a person has used either a straight razor or a safety razor. But in the Middle Ages, when the Ritva lived, this was a precaution. And so even though it was possible to shave with scissors and other forms rather than a razor, one still usually avoided it. Now, that does not mean, however, that the beard conveys any magical properties. As we see from a modern Orthodox response, what is preferable, he was asked, a Torah teacher with a beard or a Torah teacher without a beard? Who can explain better? Meaning you've got one teacher with a beard and you've got another better teacher that doesn't have a beard, presumably because he is using an electric razor. The answer, the one who explains better, since learning Torah is a greater mitzvah than having a beard. Right? As we already saw, having the beard is not the mitzvah. Shaving off the beard is the problem. So if you find a way to remove the follicles that don't violate the commandment, by all means. You're not obligated to have a beard. It's just that it wasn't really easy to avoid it until the modern time. And obviously, in keeping with Shavuot, the one who can teach the Torah best is the person you want to go to. We don't pick our teachers based upon the size of their beard. So what counts? Well, the full beard counts as the object of not shaving. So we keep the razor away from that part of our face, full stop. But when it comes time for peyot, for the corners, we are looking at the literal corner of our head, which you draw a line from your hairline up here on the side. I'm trying to see myself while also show myself, which is hard to do. From up on the side, draw it back to the top of the ear, and anything below that is where you keep the razor off of. Again, you can absolutely still trim that with scissors or with an electric razor and wear your hair in a style you like, but keep the straight razor away. As you can imagine, for some people, they wish to show that they are being extra careful to avoid a problem, and thus you will see that they will grow this hair longer than any other hair on their body. Now, that's not required, it's not necessary, it's customary only in some communities, and when they do that, those long curls, which are often self-curled by the twirling of a finger, become known as peyot, literally corners, that are being worn as a symbol of their refusal to even trim or give the hint that they have somehow damaged those corners.
Rabbi,
Yes.
question, can you review again, maybe I missed it, the specificity around clean shavenness with the razor? What's the hang up around and about the razor?
So the hang up about the razor goes back to linguistics, which is to say, when it says that you will not round off, that you will not destroy, that you will not cut, all of the words that are used in this are considered to be the word for shaving, if you will, in ancient Hebrew. That there are different words for cutting than there are for shaving, just like there are in English. And so when the rabbis are trying to isolate the details of the commandment so that we know specifically what it was that God was telling us not to do, the best translation that we can use for modern English would be a razor. What it would more literally perhaps be is a bare naked blade on the skin. But in English, we generally call that a razor. But it is true that if you were to take a large hunting knife, a la Crocodile Dundee, and shave with that, that would also be prohibited. It's the bare naked blade is connected linguistically to all of the words that talk about prohibiting the removal on the face. It would be the equivalent in English if the Torah had been given in English, and God forbid that had happened because English is so confusing. But if the Torah had been given in English, it would be the same as if it said, do not shave the corners of your head. And it talked about cutting in other places. And we would say, aha, shaving is different than cutting. So what counts as shaving? And then we would use logic to take the next few steps. Any other questions or comments? All right, then we will leave it there for today. Again, to everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this additional study, and I look forward to seeing everybody on next Thursday evening. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.